Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, this episode is going up a day early because I am headed into New York City for my pharma job. I've got 20 in-person meetings scheduled with member companies and prospective members of my trade association, along with a political event in Central Jersey, right in the middle of that. I've got no idea how my voice is going to hold up or how the mask-nose interface is going to be. I've gone so long without having to wear a mask in any long-term sort of setting. I also have no idea how I'm going to deal with the logistics of staying in a pal's apartment Monday night, changing in the morning, doing all the meetings, driving to New Brunswick, and staying down there Tuesday night, getting up Wednesday morning, changing, etc., driving back to the city Wednesday for a full day of meetings before driving home. But shit, it's not like I'm digging ditches in 90-degree temperatures. So, all things considered, if this is the biggest hassle I have to deal with, not that bad. Otherwise, things remain okay. The weather's getting warm enough that I can go outside to draw, which helps my mood. Now, to be honest, I'm dealing with some physical injuries, so that I may have to give up running. I am not very happy about that right now, but I am compartmentalizing in a good way. Just don't try and tell me what I should do about running, and I won't take it out on you. And I'm, otherwise trying to figure out ways to cope with things if I'm not able to get back to running. I will probably end up making more podcasts because I'll have all that extra time or something. So speaking of, let's get to this week's conversation. Now, my guest this time around is Rebecca Mead, the New Yorker contributor. I met Rebecca in spring of 2017 when I recorded my second conversation with her husband, George Prochnick, and I gave her an open-ended pitch to record sometime. A while later, I hit her up to see if we could schedule something, and she told me that she and George and their son Raphael were moving from Brooklyn to London, so that was going to be on hold. But now she has a wonderful new book out, and I finally got her on the podcast. Yay! It's called Homeland, Home/Land, a memoir of departure and return from Knopf. Came out February 2022, and it is an utterly gorgeous exploration of home, family, identity, both personal and national. And, well, it's a memoir. So Rebecca takes the basic story of moving back to England from Brooklyn and filters it through a bunch of different lenses. So she gives the reader not just the experience of finding a place and getting enough bookshelves installed so that she and George can rehouse their library. This was clearly a very important thing for me when I was reading the book. But you also get a sense of the roots of her family and her history, coming from a seaside town to Oxford and then New York City, where she lived for 30 years and where she chose to become an American citizen. And you get her son's experience as a 13-year-old acclimating himself to this new world now and the subtleties of MLE, Multicultural London English. And you obliquely get Trump and Brexit and what that meant to her in America and in the UK and more. I mean, it goes right down to the respective geologies of Brooklyn, which is built on granite, and London, which is built on clay, and clay that's susceptible to the phenomenon of historic movement, which is a real thing and also a theme that Rebecca weaves into the book. Homeland is really remarkable and compressed, and maybe geology and archaeology are really the right metaphors to use to describe the way she digs into layers of time and space and examines threads that are running through the landscape of history and biography. And I absolutely adored Homeland and the ways Rebecca builds up not just the move, but the lives she encounters along the way and the history she's leaving behind and what she's returning to and the moods in America and England and the personal history and family stories that inform her and George's lives. And the sense of possibility that informs the entire work. She's a little bit older than me, just a couple of years, and she refers to, in our conversation, the adventure of making a leap. And it was really compelling and fascinating to see not just the leap, but the artwork that she makes of it. I will also note, Rebecca sounded genuinely shocked when I mentioned that I live in the house where I grew up. Which is to say, as you guys know, if you're longtime listeners, I never made that leap. I let everyone else leap, and then I was the only one left here. And now I'm ensconced in northern New Jersey, close to New York, in the woods, etc. Anyway, Homeland is fantastic and a strange memoir in a good way, and really should be paired with Rebecca's previous book, My Life in Middlemarch, which is also an intriguingly and unconventionally constructed memoir. Now, if you've read Rebecca's New Yorker articles over the years, you know how economical and compelling her prose style is. So it's a joy reading that in the service of personal work like this. Now, as caveats go, there's some scratchiness on the line a couple of times. Also, near the end, I was jabbering and sort of misspoke when I implied that we, including me, need to read the whole book to understand some of the motivations within it. I meant you, the listener. I've read the entire thing, 250 pages or so, and adored this book. But I realized in saying it that Rebecca may have thought that I had not actually finished reading her book before we talked. I never do that. I always finish the guest book. I will put off a podcast rather than meet with a guest whose work I haven't finished. Anyway, that's me and my caveats. Here's Rebecca's bio from Homeland. Rebecca Mead has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1997. She has profiled many subjects and has contributed more than 200 pieces to the talk of the town. She is the author of One Perfect Day and My Life in Middlemarch, a New York Times bestseller. She has served as a McGraw Professor of Writing at Princeton University and is the recipient of a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship. She lives in London. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Rebecca Mead. What's home? And what's home to you?
Oh, such an easy question.
I was going to save it for the end, but I thought that'd be a nice opener.
It's funny because I think it does shift. I mean, while I was writing the book, while I was writing Homeland, I was in London. It was during the pandemic. I couldn't travel. I couldn't go back to New York, where I had lived for 30 years and had left sort of telling myself I'd be able to be backwards and forwards all the time. I wasn't really leaving. It was, just a little bit further across from, moving from Manhattan to Brooklyn. It's just a bit bigger than the East River, but not so different, And so when I was writing the book, I mean, I think there's even a line in the book where I say that when I think about where I ask myself where home is, I think of the house that I lived in Brooklyn for 15 years.
And the park.
And that, because I missed it so much and I felt such a strong sense of loss and renunciation in giving all of that up. And it was where I had made my family with George, my husband, and where my son had grown up and where I'd helped to raise my stepchildren. And it was very powerfully a family home. And, so that while I was writing the book, certainly that loomed very large for me as a lost home. I'm also in this weird and fortunate position of my childhood home still being where my mother lives. My mother's 90. She'll be 91 in just a couple of months. And she still lives in the house in which I grew up. And so that's another home that I go back to and have gone back to for, decades, having left. That's another very powerful sense of home. And then London, now that I'm here, I wouldn't say I feel at home in London. I don't exactly. That's one of the things I like about it, the sense of novelty and discovery that still is ongoing. So I don't know. Home is where the books are, maybe. I don't know.
I have a question about that too, but we'll get to it later on. I do note that I live in the house I grew up in. Yeah, I know. It freaks everyone out. I'm 51. I've been here probably 40 to 45 years of my life.
Wow.
And it's real. I'm 25 miles from New York City. So, being isolated and being in the same place all this time isn't that bad because at least I'm close to the world. Mm-hmm. But for everyone else who's mobile and had to pick up and move, I just, I don't want to say envy, but it's the
very same house.
Yes, I'm literally in what was the rec room and guest bedroom downstairs. I've converted it into a library, of course, where all the books are, and that's where I work during the day and what I made my office out of. But it's a strange trip.
Do you sleep still in your childhood bedroom?
No, luckily that's a guest bedroom. I in Freudian triumph, I sleep in the master bedroom where my parents used to sleep. Right. That must mean something, but we did throw out my dad's old bed set. But it's a strange phenomenon. I admit, because America is so typified by mobility and travel and just picking up and going somewhere. And it's something that I wondered over the course of reading Homeland, and we could talk about where the book began for you, which is how I usually start these things off. But I figure, we could be more fun like this. Did your reasons for moving become different or clearer in retrospect over the course of writing the book? Did things occur to you that maybe were driving the move in ways that you weren't thinking of consciously?
Yeah, I mean, I think they did. I mean, when we first started to talk about moving to England from New York, I did not make a great priority the idea that I would be returning to be closer to my mother, because I had been gone for so long from the orbit of my parents. I left England for the first time when I was 21, and I went back fractionally when I was 25 for less than a year, and then I returned to the United States and spent, the next 20-something years in New York. And I had made my peace with not being around my parents as much as somebody who's in the same country or, relatively close by. My father died a little more than 10 years ago, and I had not been around for his decline mostly, and not there for his death. And that was what I had to live with, that fact of life and fact of death. And my mother had never once asked me to come back. She had never once even said, "Oh, it would be so nice if you all came back," in some kind of manipulative way. She never wanted, she never said she wanted me to. Or she never made me feel that I had to. So it wasn't that wasn't what I told myself was a motivation. But having come back, I have been so grateful to be that much closer to her than, and that much more available and that much easier to reach her than I always was. And and especially given the pandemic, the idea of, having the idea of being stranded across the other side of the ocean from her during these past 2 years would have been incredibly difficult to stand. Of course, what we have had to be, I have had to be stranded on the other side of the ocean from my stepsons and from my sister-in-law and brothers-in-law and father-in-law and all of my American family and George's family. But I have been at least on the same landmass as my mother, and that has been a comfort.
What did you miss about England when you were here? And what do you miss about Brooklyn now that you're there?
I for a long time, there wasn't that, I didn't think about what I missed in England.
That doesn't seem to be a driver in the book. And so I was wondering whether it's...
I really didn't miss much. I was always, of course I missed people, sure. I missed friends and all of that. And I missed a certain kind of aspect of sort of English kind of, I don't know, people always talk about the humor, there's that. But I didn't even miss that very much, because there's a sort of defeatedness about English humor, and sort of the English sensibility that I came to be really, really irritated by. The more American I became, the more earnest and sincere I became, the more intolerant I became of kind of English resignation and sort of understatedness and all those things. Those are aspects of the sort of English character that I quite like now, but and of course it's facile to talk about the English character as if there were such a single thing, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
I always have England, Your England by Orwell in my head. That's one of the touchstones, so, for good or bad, but anyway.
Yeah, there's a sort of resignation of things, or of just things all being not quite worth the bother, or never quite going to work out. That it's very typical here. It's really a kind of not wanting to dare to do something or feel something, sure. Crucially, because that might result in that will raise the stakes of beyond what's tolerable. So I didn't really miss any of that, and I didn't really miss a whole lot. I was so exhilarated by New York for such a long time, and so grateful for all of the opportunities that I had there and the freedom that I felt there, and the ways in which I could sort of make my own way, and that it was, that I was able to do that, and that I, have had and I hope continue to have a nice career, and so no, there wasn't. I didn't move back because I was secretly longing for years to move back, or I'd always had a plan that I would move back, or I never quite took it seriously that I was in America for good or anything like that. It was much more of a much more immediate rupture and break, and impulsive in some ways. Although, it's hard to move continents impulsively, but there was something impulsive.
Well, there's once you say it has to happen. So, there is the impulsion of peer pressure, I guess, once you've
announced it to other people. Yeah. But, once you've said it to yourself, you could just, revise that position to yourself. But there was
I've walked back a great many commitments in my life. Don't worry.
No, but there's many, there was a very short gap between George and myself deciding we were going to do it and doing it. There was basically not much pause for thought.
Mm-hmm. And you have Homeland now, and George also has a memoir coming out later this year, I think,
He does.
about the decision to move there.
Yeah.
So was the move, planned with a book contract? And I'm just kidding. But, were there ideas, what prompted in either case for you guys to write about it, to convert this experience?
Well, I'll let George talk to you about his when his comes out.
I'm hoping to, yeah.
And it's wonderful. Yeah, you should. But
make sure your stories match too. I'm just kidding.
Make sure we've lined up. And but in my case, I mean, in some ways it began. I wrote an essay for the New Yorker about having become an American citizen, which I did in 2011, and then deciding to leave, which we did in 2018. So I wrote a piece about feeling in the wake of the election of 2016 that my sense of what America promised to be and the America that I had become felt fractured and undermined and at risk of disappearing altogether. So that was part of what the essay was about. And then the essay was also about this sense of, I'm in the middle, I hope, of my adult life. And, I've had 3 decades in New York, and if I'm lucky, I might live another 3 decades, probably less now. Do I want them all to be in one place? Is it like, I once had the wherewithal or ambition to sort of uproot myself from my provincial English background and move to New York, a place where I'd never been, and make a life there. And I didn't want that to be the only time I ever made a leap. And leaping back to the place I came from, may not look like the most, adventurous of leaps, but in so many ways it is, because it's, I've moved to London, which is the city in which I was born, but it's not a city I lived in for very much of my adult life. I had a brief stint here, as I said, in my mid-20s, but mostly I don't know it, and so it's new. And London and England and Britain have changed so much in the decades that I was away that it's not returning to something that I know. It's really returning to something that in so many ways has a great deal of unfamiliarity about it and a lot to be learned. So it's not, I don't confidently reclaim my place of origin. I'm definitely very much kind of humbly trying to find my place in the world.
You describe yourself as a deracinated New Yorker at one point. Do you still feel that?
Yeah. I mean, I do feel, and it's very, it used to drive me crazy when I would come back to Britain to visit when I lived in New York, and I just didn't sound or look like I was any different because my voice hadn't really changed, and I do find myself, maybe less now, several years on, but certainly when I first got here, the fact that I was from New York, or recently from New York, and having lived there for many decades, was like the first thing I would tell anybody in case they made the mistake of thinking that I was just another English person. I am now an American as well as a British person, and I'm glad to be, and I'm not giving up my passport. And it's an important part of my identity. It's like the 30 years of my, becoming an adult and into my middle age, and it made me who I am in so many ways.
I will say my mom came to America in 1965 from Hendon and has yet to lose the accent. So, it'll stick with you for life. But I did wonder, though, the leaving Trump's America for Brexit Britain, had you guys ever considered Canada at any point as a sort of a safer but still English-speaking place to...
I don't think you can't just move to Canada, though, can you? You can't just Canada, I'm going there. Canada has to let you in. Canada has to want you. True. We didn't have any rights in Canada. We could, at the time of moving, have still gone to a European country because Britain was still a member of the EU, and subsequent to Britain leaving the EU, George has acquired an EU citizenship of his own. I'm sure he can tell you about that. So that's we've switched EU rights in our marriage, but we still share them. In like joint rights. In
like
some
rootless cosmopolitans.
I'm
just kidding.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I mean, Brexit had been the Brexit referendum had happened when we decided to come back here. That was already a done deal, but the deal itself was not done, and exactly what the shape it would take was still formless. And the first year and a half that we were here, it was just a sort of farcical. Like they couldn't decide, they couldn't come to a deal, they couldn't arrange it, and there was even a hope that there might be a second referendum, and it might not happen. And I didn't think that there would be as hard a Brexit as there ended up being. I didn't really fully think through the possibility of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister.
Well, again, flashback to 2016, and not a lot of us were,
but it's something I said in the essay that I wrote for the New Yorker in 2018 is that I recognize we live in a time, not in a place, and everywhere the same symptoms are presenting themselves, the same kinds of political movements in directions that are not to my liking are happening, and you can't escape it. We just move to another version of it, one with healthcare.
Go figure. Yeah. So let me ask again about writing Homeland. In comparison to writing My Life in Middlemarch, which also a memoir, but one that has an external peg, I guess, in terms of George Eliot and the book Middlemarch. How different was this writing for you compared to that one?
Very different.
Or from any previous work?
Very different from any previous writing experience that I had had. I mean, My Life in Middlemarch is a memoir, but it, as you say, has this very strong sort of spine, skeleton structure that borrows from and leans upon George Eliot's novel and George Eliot's own biography. So even just in terms of how to structure the book, I knew that I was writing within a shape that was determined by the shape of George Eliot's novel. But this book was much, and there's nothing to lean on except for myself. And I can't, it turns out you can't really lean on yourself. So it was much harder to, do. It was much harder to have the confidence to do. It was much harder technically to do, to figure out, well, what is my structure? Is there a chronology? Yes and no. Is there a is there a sort of, is it,
say theme?
Is it, this chapter's about, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, not really. It's deliberately kind of, I don't know what the word is, meandering, but that's not exactly the word I'm looking for.
It's almost organic. It does feel threaded and I would say artificial, but in terms of artifice, it does feel, very, very, well constructed and engineered, but it has that I say free flowingness. Gosh, yeah, we're coming up with horrible adjectives for this.
Well, thank you though. I'm glad, because what I wanted, there were certain sort of themes and experiences that I became very consumed by when I first got back here, and wanted to write about and explore. And the sense, like the sense of Britain and London itself, of having this very, very layered history that you can see see it written into the streets. You can see it, you can walk through the city of London and you've got a skyscraper on one side of you and the Roman wall of the city on the other side of you, and 2,000 years in, the glimpse of an eye. And I find it very thrilling and very suggestive that this life of London, this sort of the density and the generation upon generation living in these layered places, and that was something I wanted to write about, both in the history of the city, but also my own family history, because I returned to the city in which my parents grew up, and my grandparents on my father's side were living, not a million miles from where I now live in London. So it was a sort of recovery, but almost archaeological recovery, and then I also became obsessed with the way in which London is built on clay. And that
I was going to say
that the city is just built on this kind of shifting, slippery, untrustworthy foundation, unlike New York, much of which, not all of it, but much of it is built on granite. And, and this first presents itself as like a housing issue. Like, how am I going to buy, how am we going to move into a house that's got, are these cracks in it caused by something that happened yesterday? Are they something that happened 100 years ago? These are not things that I had to think about when I was living in New York, and they became a metaphor for how unstable everything felt, both kind of geopolitically and in my own life, having sort of thrown up a relatively stable life in Brooklyn and thrown it all in the air and decided to do something completely different.
Was anything off limits for you in terms of writing? And don't worry, nobody's listening, so we can talk about it here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, lots of things are off limits. Yeah. But they're off limits. So,
I figure we don't know each other that well. So, so I think we met at the second time I recorded with George, but that's, I miss the bookshelves. I have these wonderful pictures of George in front of the bookshelves, and that's the big thing I regret about you moving to England.
Yeah, they were very beautiful bookshelves. It's true, and they held a lot of books.
Yes, they did. Which is the big question: culling books before the move. Were there books you left behind that you wouldn't have imagined leaving behind maybe 10 years earlier? Or did you manage to bring pretty much everything that you know?
No, I don't. I mean, we definitely didn't bring everything, because I'm constantly having to buy things that I thought I had and that I just can't find. And it may be that they're shelved in some way that I can't make sense of. And there are too many books for me to know where everything is. And my acquaintance with their arrangement on the shelves here is too brief for me to have internalized it. When you live with them for a long time, you know where everything is, and I don't know where.
Oh, this library is a map of my brain.
Yeah,
it's only a couple of thousand books, but yeah, I know where everything is, and if I don't, I take that as a really bad sign.
Yeah,
if I can't find something.
Yeah, no, it's true, but this is if to the extent that the books are in my house are a map of my brain, it shows how scattered and incoherent it is. But so I do have to sometimes buy a new one here and there. I think we brought 170 boxes of books, but we definitely got rid of maybe half of that was deaccessioned.
Did it turn into any sort of dynamic or tension between you guys as to, we can't bring this? If we bring this, we've got to bring these other 25 books? Or were you guys pretty in sync with, what stays and what goes?
I think we were pretty in sync, but I have to say that whole period of disassembling a house, it's so, it was not a kind of, should we keep this? Should we get rid of this? Should we do that? Yeah. It was like clearing out a house of a loved one who was dead.
Oh, the paragraph or two you have about that almost brought me to tears. That sense of you in your own you in your own death home, basically, that you're taking apart a place after the occupants have died. I thought that was such an incredibly arresting image.
And because, the life that you've lived in it has died in some sense, you're giving
Now you know
it
why
up.
I haven't moved.
What's that?
Now you know why I haven't moved all these years.
Yeah. So it's an absolutely, utterly, I found the experience of doing that absolutely and utterly wrenching. And, moving is a huge, moving house is a huge pain in the ass anyway. I mean, it's difficult. It's one of those things that you forget how awful it is after you've done it, but it is awful. Leaving that life was, I mean, it was, I was in a state of, real grief while doing it for months and months on end.
But with some sense of I don't want to say optimism, but promise of what was awaiting.
Yeah. Because having decided to do this thing and make this move, there was a lot about it that I was excited for. And, one of the things that I was hopeful about and excited for, and the one lingering kind of, not nostalgia for England, but like urge towards England, was on behalf of my son, who was 13 just turned 13 when we left. So 12 when we first sort of broached the subject of moving to him. And, the idea that I wanted to make really available to him the side of his, inheritance that is Britain and England and London, and not for it not to just be a place that he visited his grandmother and liked and got ice cream and stuff, but that he knew it and he had a sense of ownership of it. That was important to me. And it's not that I had always had that in my head as something that I wanted to do, but I guess the more the years passed and the smaller the window of opportunity to do that appeared, the more compelling as an idea that became to open the world up to him, not just to give him London, but to give him internationalism and to give him cosmopolitanism, and to give him a sense of, that things don't have to be the way that they are in Brownstone, Brooklyn.
Do you get the impression he would stay in England for university or look to America? I know it's pretty early, right? He's still...
No, it's not. It's only a year or so away, and I mean, I think
not to put you on the spot. And it's a private question about him.
University is aside. I mean, he is. I don't know what he'll do with his life. He still sounds completely American, although he can do a very good British accent. And he identifies as American, but he loves London. I think he also identifies as a Londoner. I'm not sure that he would actually say that. I'm probably putting words into his mouth, but he does feel that sense of ownership of at least this bit of London that we're in, that I'm grateful for, pleased to see. But he's also deeply American.
Gotcha. So beyond the differences between writing these two memoirs, how has your New Yorker writing changed since the move? And of course, that overlaps with pandemic experience and how that would have affected your writing in Brooklyn. But do you write differently? Do you write about things differently? I know the topics might be different based on what's local. But... Yeah,
I mean, I do write about things differently. I don't know whether I write, whether my prose style has changed, probably not too much, but I mean, I had to have the book. The book is being published in the UK next month, and it was read by an English reader who sort of highlighted all the places in which I said apartment rather than flat, or elevator instead of lift, and change them back so that they don't look like an affectation to a British reader. I read the anglicized version of it and think, God, I don't talk like that now. But it's only a few words here or there, and I guess the choice is made to make it sound, not make a British reader sort of pull up on it and wonder why I'm saying apartment rather than flat. But New Yorker writing, definitely the kind of subject matter has changed. I mean, partly that has been due to the pandemic and the kind of, in New York, I wrote a lot of profiles of people, cultural figures often, and I still do that. But I did less of it during the pandemic because nobody was doing anything, making anything, and I didn't want to write a Zoom profile of anybody, and I wasn't, very much didn't want to do that. So I was finding other things to write about, and actually I have really loved finding other sort of forms to take, and I've loved writing about. I've written quite a bit about kind of English history or things that are related to sort of the historical, the landscape. I wrote a piece about the I mean, one piece I did a thing about a Viking hoard that was dug up by some guys and then hidden and stolen away, and that was super fun. That was like my primary pandemic piece, because just sort of sitting in my house when I couldn't go anywhere and reading about the Vikings, endless books about the Vikings, was really amazing. It was great, and I loved doing that story. And I guess I've written about, last year I wrote a piece about the so-called Cerne Abbas giant, which is a chalk figure that's carved on a hillside not far from where I grew up, that is a naked man with an enormous erect penis, and nobody knew where he came from or how long he'd been there, whether he was ancient Roman, whether he was from the Middle Ages, whether he was from the 16th century. And there was some analysis done just last year to try to figure out how old he actually is. And I loved writing that stuff. I love writing these kind of, I really, really, I think I've said I love writing this stuff.
Yeah. So when it comes to the interviewing and profiling, especially of cultural figures, what's it taught you about people? Or are these such specific individuals that it's tough to draw something larger from the experience of sitting and talking with them? Or what's it taught you about yourself? And of course, what are you afraid I'm going to ask you? That's
I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm always so interested in other people's, methods and techniques and preparation that they do. And, and being on the receiving end of being interviewed rather than conducting the interview is always a bit weird. I don't know that I don't know that I could say anything general about what doing this has taught me, because it's so separate from, that would be to sort of separate it out and say that I could have lived my life and not learned this thing about how people operate if I wasn't doing this job. And I don't think...
Well, if I didn't have the podcast, I never would have learned to talk to human beings. If I didn't do this for 10 years and learn to just sit and look at another person's face and let them talk and listen and respond to it, I realized in my 40s, I wasn't really doing that before.
Oh, well, that's amazing that you've had that, that it's given you that opportunity. That's really brilliant. Yeah. I mean, I find, I do feel, having the reporter's notebook in my hand gives me tremendous license to go places, talk to people that in, another life I would never have had the right to. I would never have had the right to ask the kinds of questions that I might ask, and go to the places, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to go to the places that I have gone to. But I don't know. I think the difference between many differences between you doing a podcast and me doing the kinds of interviews I do is that I'm thinking a lot about how I'm going to write the piece.
It's mediated
and
through you.
Very
certainly.
little, in fact, of what anybody says ends up going into the piece. It's not like I have colleagues who are amazing at doing Q&As, like Isaac Chotiner does these incredible Q&As. I have no idea how he does it. It's an incredible skill. It's nothing like what I do.
As somebody pointed out on Twitter, if he ever calls and says, "I'd like to interview you," that's basically the cue to just burn your computer and walk into the ocean because you're done.
Yeah, the guy's amazing, and it's such a different skill. Such a different skill. So yeah.
But in terms of from what your perspective is, taking all that and trying to make something that's not a transcript. Yeah, I get where you're coming from. You mentioned the Lou Reed experience where you kind of panicked and melted down, and I've talked about when I recorded with Irvin Welsh how he mentioned standing up David Bowie twice because he just realized he could never sit in a room with a guy whose posters he had on his wall since he was, a kid. But, and we all have our moments like that. But have you had a without having to name names necessarily, don't meet your idols moment in this, or does it come out in terms of the prose?
Were they really disappoint you?
I'll put it this way. Robert McCrum, when I asked him that question without blinking, said Philip Roth, the single worst interview experience I've ever had, and then went into depth about why it was such a terrible experience. On mic, I was like, well, okay, that's good to know.
Oh, I never met
So not asking for anything like that, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a very, very good question. And I wish I had a rapid Robert McCrum type answer to give you.
I was taken aback, and I'd read that interview and thought there was something wrong and wasn't sure. But yeah, it's
no. I wish I did. I'll have to. It'll come to me, and it'll be after we've spoken.
Yeah. Well, I thought of that in relation to the section you have in the book about Morrissey and Every Day is Like Sunday, which captured your youth and a song and video you tried foisting off on your son to get him to really understand what your upbringing was like. But you also lead into who Morrissey became, what he meant when you were young, and how you try to reconcile, we'll just say the person Morrissey became with the person you idolized and loved when you were young. Right.
Well, I mean, and I don't know the person Morrissey became because Morrissey is one of those people that I've never interviewed. Sure. And probably, it wouldn't be a great idea. But I mean, I think that feeling of how much I wrote about Morrissey because I wanted to wrote a couple of pages because I wanted to write about that kind of that way that when you're a teenager, a song or an artwork or whatever can capture you, or an artist can so so completely capture your sensibility so that you feel an identification with them, not that you're them, but that they speak for you. And I still, those early Morrissey songs and Smith songs still speak to me. They still, every day still is like Sunday.
Yeah. And that sense of, again, not disappointment and not the cancel thing, but the, loving someone's work when, in their later days, and nothing Morrissey has talked about publicly as anything on the, Bill Cosby level or something like that. But that sense of, reconciling appreciation of the artwork for, itself, I suppose, as opposed to who the artist ends up being or becoming.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I think that, I mean, I don't have a kind of, have a sort of fully fleshed out theory of, you know, what we should feel about, you know, individuals who make great art you know, who then turn out to be human, and maybe different from us or different from how we imagined them or would hope them to be. I mean, I don't have a sort of.
I'm with you. I'm just incredibly lucky that no one I've ever recorded with has been canceled or otherwise, you know, had some massive scandal around who they are, which I consider myself either lucky or I'm just kind of tame in terms of who I record with. But
well,
but
yeah, maybe just keep recording.
Yeah. Oh, that's my thing. You know, Harold Bloom got a little. Well, there's some controversy, but you know, not enough to have wrecked his reputation or anything. But the real question I have, and the one that you know you alluded to through our conversation just now about the artworks that completely capture you when you're young. Read Middlemarch since returning?
Have I read Middlemarch since returning? You know, I have not read it all the way through. I have read parts of it because I've gone back to sort of think about it and write additional little things about it. And one of the things that you know, that one of the aspects of it is that I had not thought about until the last couple of years is the fact that there's a looming cholera epidemic that's, you know, on the fringes of the story, and actually, you know, in some ways triggers certain things in the denouement of the plot. But I have not. I'm longing to actually sit down with it and go through it. You know, have the full immersion in it again. But I did spend so much time with it when I was writing My Life in Middlemarch that I wanted to leave it long enough that when I went back to it, it wouldn't just be the same book that I'd read when I was writing that book, or that it would, you know, I didn't want to have. I didn't, you know, I want to leave an interval of time so that it will say new things to me. But because of my sort of intimacy with it in those more recent years, I felt like I needed to give it longer than the usual kind of 5-year cycle.
Yeah. It's something that when your husband had mentioned returning to Proust every couple of years, I thought, shouldn't it be longer in between? You sort of need to change and reify. Again, I've only done it once all the way through.
Yeah, he does it.
You know.
He's always reading Proust, not quite always, but almost always. But he's yet to write a book about that. So if he did, he might then put it down for slightly longer.
Yeah, discover that, you know, whatever the subject is, we're all going to grow sick of it eventually if we spend too much time directly. It's
not even sick of it, but it's just that you know, you have a version of it, and I have a version of Middlemarch, or I had a version of Middlemarch that I wrote about when I was, you know, in my early mid-40s. That was the one that I put down on the page in My Life in Middlemarch, and I need to get enough distance on that version of Middlemarch for it to become new to me again.
What other books do you return to most often?
I have been looking again. You know, I write about this in the book, but I've been looking again at reading again Mrs. Dalloway, which is a book that, you know, means more living in London and recognizing the landscape of that novel. It's also the book that my mother sort of discovered when she became a reader of literature, kind of, you know, my mother didn't think herself to be a very successful student at school, left school at the age of 15. And it wasn't until I was going to university that she really started to, you know, engage with and read the kind of canon of English literature that I was working my way through as a student. And Mrs. Dalloway was one of those books that she then, I don't think she'd read it before that period, but she started to read it then, and she reads it. That's one that, in fact, she emailed me today and said she'd been sitting in her house reading Mrs. Dalloway again, which I love.
I see this as another memoir that starts to thread your two memoirs together in terms of more about the family and the literature. And in fact, I'm going to completely mangle her name, but I'm supposed to record with the woman who did the annotated Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God! I was going to pronounce it so close to that, but still get something wrong. Okay, I'm glad you said it instead of me. But yeah, I happened to reread the book early this year, and someone mentioned to me, "Oh, is this annotated Miss Dalloway? You should go talk to the editor writer," and that's turned into later this year. So
she's a powerhouse.
Yeah, it's that's the thing. Once I started following her on Twitter, it just never stopped. I was like, wow, she is. We will have a lot to talk about, so that's good. But when I mention next memoir or next book, you thinking of another memoir or non-memoir, non-fiction? Or...
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't have another. I don't have another book, sort of on begun or immediately on the horizon. I have a big job at the New Yorker, and I don't need to fill my time with writing books unless there's something that is really compelling for me to do. And one of the things that writing books is for me, at least with these last two books, is to do a kind of writing that I cannot do for the New Yorker, or would not do for the New Yorker, and wouldn't imagine, wouldn't think of doing for the New Yorker. It's a different kind of process and a different kind of prose too. The kind of the difficulty of writing books, the loneliness and the sort of doubt and the anxiety and all of that is so much harder.
So what's funny is I have all that and I don't make books. I should at least put something into writing instead. Jeez, at least all those things would be going to a useful purpose.
Well, I know, but the podcasts are the new books anyway. So you're doing...
Yeah, I pretend this is my art form.
There you
are.
Yeah.
But let me ask, when you mentioned the New Yorker writing and the things you can do in the magazine versus what you do with a book, this will sound weird, but when did you realize you were a New Yorker writer exactly? I mean, I know you were writing for them, but was there a moment of getting that, oh, this is what it means to be writing as a writer in that magazine? And I don't mean in terms of outside appreciation, but more this is how you do this, I suppose. I'm
trying to think. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I mean, the minute that you sent on assignment and you say, I'm from the New Yorker, there's you have this kind of, there's this kind of access and power that's really remarkable and, a bit daunting. This is so nerdy, but I write in Microsoft Word now. When we first started, when I first started at the New Yorker, we used a particular kind of publishing program, the name of which I cannot remember. But you could write if you wanted to in columns in the font of the New Yorker.
Oh wow! So it would look like the layout.
Yeah. So it would look. So I could write a talk of the. I was hired at the New Yorker as a talk of the town writer and 800-word pieces, and I could write that 800-word piece, to look on my screen as if it was. Had been cut from the pages of the New Yorker, and there's something so that's when I became a New Yorker writer, once I got the font, and then the font is like wearing a really well-tailored suit that's comfortable, but it makes you sit up straight or something like that. It's not slouchy. gives you form.
And in terms of getting better at writing, especially within the magazine, are there things you recognize early on? God, I wouldn't have written it like this.
Oh,
10
I mean,
years
all
later.
the time. If I look back at, I know I've also written so much. I've written so much that there are things I've written that I don't remember that I've written. Somebody wrote to me the other day asking about. I got a message on Twitter from somebody. Elsa Clench had died, and they were trying to find out some details about her life, and they looked up my profile of her, and they knew it was a long time ago, but did I have any contacts for Elsa Clench? And I could barely remember. You don't know who Elsa Clench is. I could barely remember who she is. She was
oh no, I know, trust me.
You know who she is. Okay, so I had more or less forgotten that I had written a profile of her. I don't even know when I did it. It's like the late 90s probably. I can't remember, so long ago. And that happens, and the more that I do, and I write a lot for the online magazine, and those pieces are things that you do very quickly, and they're up within 24 hours or whatever, and it's not hard to not quite always remember everything that you've done.
There's the fire and forget thing. I've got episodes where it's like, boy, I don't even remember recording with that person. And
but then, sometimes you have, and I'm sure, I hope you have this too, but sometimes you have this like very satisfying, go back and look at something and think, well, I have no idea how I did that, because I can't get back into the head of that at all. But B, it's not bad. It works quite well. So that does, it does happen. I don't, you don't look at everything and think, oh, Jesus, that was, but that.
Yeah. Well, there has to be the validation of you're still there. If it was really as bad as I tend to criticize my own stuff for, they wouldn't keep you around. So,
Hope so.
Yep. I'll take it as a positive. My last question, though, because we're getting on the hour, and you've got a lot going on. My brother always asks whenever I have any literary guests, Middlemarch or Bleak House. In your case, we know Middlemarch. So I asked my brother yesterday, what else would you ask somebody who wrote the book on this? And he asks, are Middlemarch and Bleak House two doctors looking at the same patient?
Oh my God, your brother. Have you done a podcast with him?
We did. It was like the third or fourth one I ever did. And it was about the fact that his home had burned down maybe a year or so before. And it was about how you rebuild your library when everything has been gone, which, it's the, sort of fascinating stuff I care about, and the sort of things that he and I can talk about, without having to be human, which I related earlier in the inability to actually listen to people when they're talking. But anyway, Bo is a teacher in a private school out in St. Louis, and has read Middlemarch and Bleak House numerous times, and he wonders, are they looking?
I don't have an answer, I'm afraid. I can't. I'm going to disappoint him. But does he? Presumably, he believes same patient, different doctors.
He wonders, are they this? Is it the same England? It's too different. It's town and country. I told him, but they're both focusing almost around the same moment, and they're very, very different books. And he used to be in favor of Bleak House, and over the years leaned more towards Middlemarch because it's more, I think, for the reasons you talk about in that memoir, that it's more human.
Wow. Well, now I'm going to go back, and instead of reading Middlemarch again, I'm going to go back and reread Bleak House and see if I can.
Maybe I'll do a three-way podcast. I've got you and Boaz on the call together. But on the strength of that, last thoughts, anything on how the return has sort of affected how you look at Brooklyn and America? Or, do you feel that we need to read Homeland to capture where you are? Well,
I mean, if you read, I would love you and anybody else listening to read Homeland, and it will capture where I was when I was writing it. That's the very peculiar thing about books, isn't it? That you write them in a moment and then they get published considerably later, and you're already somewhere else than you were when you wrote it. I mean, there's so much in that book that is about arrival that I wanted to capture while it still struck me as very new and strange. And I'm already much more familiar with the environment that I'm now in than I was, a couple of years ago when I was, first putting those paragraphs down on the page. So every book is a moment, and it's also, and every book is this is a non-fiction book, but every book is also a fiction in a sense of it's compiled and shaped and created and molded and formed. That doesn't really answer your question about whether there's anything I miss about Brooklyn or America.
Yeah. Or at least that it's changed. Anything it's changed about your retrospect. But again, I think you capture so much of it in terms of that flux and taking place in the historic moment it does. And then, as you settle into it, you fall into the pandemic simultaneously. There's an awful lot there, and it's not something you can just parse out and say, oh, this is a universal, so much as, this is the really, really specific experience that we can, correlate things from our own lives to.
Yeah, well, that's the best.
Which isn't really a question either. Sorry.
No. But I mean, if it is that, then I will have done my work.
I think you did a fantastic job, and look forward to seeing your stuff in the New Yorker, and maybe getting together in person for a podcast someday.
One day.
I look forward to seeing the bookshelves.
All right. Thank you so much.
And that was Rebecca Mead. Her wonderful new book is Homeland, a memoir of departure and return from Knopf. It's out. You should read it. You should also get her previous memoir, My Life in Middlemarch, which I love. I do, as we mentioned here, want to get her and my brother on the show sometime to have a compare and contrast with Middlemarch and Bleak House. We'll see how that goes. You should also hit up the New Yorker's site and check out all of Rebecca's work there. Her writing really is a treasure, and I'm awfully happy we got to talk. And I'm hoping when I have one of those European business trips, I can make a stop over in London and get to see her and George and the shelves and the books. Now, Rebecca does not have a website, but she is on Twitter as, ironically enough, Rebecca Mead _NYC. Maybe she'll have to update that at some point. Anyway, it's Rebecca Mead, all one word, _NYC. I'll have a link to that in the show and episode notes for this one, along with a link to her contributor page at The New Yorker. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know that there is this podcast every single week with these great long conversations with artists and writers and cartoonists and musicians and translators and publishers and all sorts of fascinating folk. You could also let me know what you like and don't like about the show, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or comic or piece of art or theater or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me an email, by leaving me a direct message on Twitter or Instagram, which is dicey. But my favorite way would be if you've sent me a postcard. I send postcards every week or every day now to people. It's my 2022 New Year's resolution. I actually started doing a video this past week of me revealing what the day's postcard is going to be each morning. Okay, it interests me. I know it doesn't interest you guys, but anyway, it's wonderful to get something in the mail, So you can find my mailing address through the weekly email that I send out, or you can hit me up and ask for it. The other thing you can do is leave me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up or anything. Messages can only be 3 minutes long, so when you leave a message, keep that in mind and let me know if it would be cool to use the message in an upcoming episode of the show. I would never use it without the speaker's permission, but maybe you want to leave a message that you want the audience to hear about something you really like. So if you feel like it, 973-869-9659. Now, if you've got money to spare, then don't give it to me. I'm doing fine with my day job. I do have a Patreon. It's VMS Pod, Virtual Memory Show Podcast. But, I post blogs and other stuff there. It's nothing that value driven. What I think you should do if you've got money to spare is help other people. There are GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Tapatogo, all sorts of crowdfunding things you can do to help individuals in need. And if you're looking for somewhere to go with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank. You should look into yours or the Poor People's Campaign or Freedom Funds or election funds, Ukrainian relief funds. There are a lot of things you can do with your even if it's only a couple of bucks, with your money that can help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.